was almost as if I was remembering something that I've always known. And it resonated so deeply that I was like, I mean, I read through the first book. I'm in the second one right now, but I read through the first book in like a week, digested the material, and I was like, I have to read it again. Like, it was so fascinating. So from your perspective, being a big teacher on this topic, what is the law of one? Deep breath.
The law of one is, it is an explanation of the nature of reality that has been channeled through a higher dimensional being called Ra. And all of the, all of the categories and concepts and things in the law of one you see them in parallels of other spiritual works or channeled works. But in the same way that I would have a certain take on reality, you would have a certain take. It's not like all higher density beings have this exact same mapped out explanation of reality. They all put it in the words that they find to be the most relevant and precise, right? And so because of that, there's a ton of parallels in like the Wingmaker's material, Law of One, Course in Miracles. You see a ton of parallels, but they're describing reality differently according to their experience of it, because reality is infinite.
Right.
So there's an infinite variety of ways you can categorize it, but Ra's take on it, they call it the law of one, which is this idea that all is one. There's only one being in the universe, and it experiences itself through each and every one of us. And we're sort of on this evolutionary journey that the source takes, where it sort of expands itself out into infinite pieces of fragments of its consciousness, and then absorbs it back into itself through evolution, so that I can have that spectrum of experience or contrast of what its nature is like. And Ra calls that the law of one.
Amazing. That's so beautiful, the way that you explain that. I would love, so from our listeners' perspective, the thing that got me the most and that I was most interested in was the densities and the explanation of those and how we go between those, which I have some questions for you about them. But if you can explain briefly the densities and how they're different from dimensions and what they all kind of entail.
Yeah, when I say density, a lot of the times the part of my mind is like, some people are totally lost.
Yeah.
What you mean, you know? But the easiest way to understand it is that a density is not a dimension in space and time. It is a non-local stage of the evolution of a soul, or the frequency of a soul. So if you imagine like a waveform, right, like this. So this would be a very low vibrational waveform. And that would be considered a density, because if you zoom out, like this table, this coffee mug is dense. Its vibration is very slow because it appears to be in the same location, and I can touch it, I can grab it, because it's not going anywhere very fast, right? Its waveform is like this at the subatomic level. But a higher vibrational frequency like this is much more ethereal and translucent and all that. So it can move around easier. It's harder to physically grab onto. The best way to think about it is like ice versus water versus steam. It's all the same thing, H2O, at different densities, right?
Yeah.
So ice is a very slow density. It's very slow.
Yes.
It's not going anywhere, right?
It's perfect for the podcast.
Right.
Yeah.
The water is more malleable and all that, and then steam is like even more malleable. So your consciousness moves through densities of evolution, where the slower the vibrational frequency of your soul's frequency is, the more difficult it's going to be for it to see through illusions, and it's going to be more trapped in 3D reality, and it's going to be trapped by more dense things because its vibration is very dense, very low vibrational. But a higher density, a higher vibration, can see through illusions easier, is not as trapped and bound to 3D reality. And so that's why souls who incarnate into a third density body, like a human, like you and I, if they're like a sixth density soul, then they tend to become enlightened easier, and they move through these lessons a lot faster. Whereas some souls, maybe like your grandparents, you might have a grandparent like this who they're still stuck in the same shit they were going through as a child. They still have not healed their childhood wounds. And you're just like, grandma, gosh, when are you going to do the inner work to heal this stuff?
Stop being a racist. Gosh.
Exactly. Right. It's like, she just might be a much lower density soul. And so that's just where she's at. So no judgment. She isn't capable of seeing that lesson yet because her soul's frequency is too slow. And as we go through evolution, it becomes faster and higher vibrational. And so we go through those lessons easier, or in previous lifetimes, we've already learned those lessons.
Right.
So in this lifetime, it's like, click, we get it within a few years and we're done with it. So
now we have to back up a little bit because we need to explain because you said third density and sixth, and I think our listeners might not know what those are.
Right.
But
so Ra lays it out in 7 densities. At least this universe, this octave, they call it, would be categorized in 7 major densities. And that's just the way that they like to slice it apart.
Yeah.
There is no real firm line, mm-hmm. It's all a spectrum, but for the sake of understanding, it's helpful for linear thinking to cut it up into pieces. So mm-hmm. Ra cuts it up into 7 pieces, and the 8th density would be the beginning of a new octave or a new universe that your soul begins from the beginning and starts another evolutionary cycle.
Mm-hmm. So Ra, which is a 6th density being, which they call a social memory complex, which is essentially loads and loads of beings that have evolved and come to this particular density to then combine their consciousness in order to be this like walking library of all this information. Correct. So the first one is elements: fire, water, air, earth, bacteria, things like that. Second density is plants and animals. The top of the second density would be like pets who started to learn ego or consciousness, guilt, shame, things like that. Third density is our human perspective, which we can tell in our government system, who's on the low end, who's on the high end. Then we have our fourth density, which is now I'm still confused a little bit about fourth density because I know that it's when we change from our chemical body, our atomic body, to our light body, or in between. And so like I would still get confused whether or not ghosts are fourth density, or if we evolve to fourth density and come back to third. So there's that. Right. Essentially, like when we start our light body, heart ray drain energy thing. And fifth density, which is essentially the path to wisdom. It's a lot of alone time and seeking enlightenment, things like that, to sixth density, which is what Ra is. And then seventh, which would be coming back to the creator. Correct?
Essentially, yeah. Very good.
Okay. So with that, there's like, to me, so when we think about religion, okay, which I think is a very juicy topic. When we talk about Jesus, we've spoken about reincarnation as if that's a given. But this is a practice or a philosophy based on the law of one as well. And so when we talk about reincarnation, like give me your philosophical, religious, or fundamental perspective of why reincarnation is a part of the law of one and what Ra talks about that, like the cycles and things like that.
Yeah. Well, if you really think about it, the context religion gives about the afterlife just makes absolutely no sense at all. There's
a lot of holes.
Yeah, it's like more holes than a block of Swiss cheese, really. It's just unbelievably absurd to say that in this infinite universe where, we say God's eternal, right? In Christianity, that God would put us here for one tiny speck of time, and then that determines our entire destiny for the rest of eternity. Mm-hmm. Like there's no possible way a soul could understand all the complexities of the human experience in one short lifetime. Mm-hmm. Some people die when they're like 15 years old, right? It's like, how is that a fair shot? There's no way. It's impossible. And the only reason that you can be a human right now and have the understanding of emotion and language and love and intimacy and fear and all these different dynamics of what it means to be a human is because you first had to experience and integrate, understand what it's like to just be a rock for billions of years. consciousness has to wake up to itself in the physical form, in the dream, before it becomes, before a new experience becomes available, right?
Mm-hmm.
So first, let me just understand what it is to be a rock.
Yeah.
And then let me understand what it is to be a plant. I mean, a plant has a lot of stuff going on,
Mm-hmm.
if you think about it.
Living system. Yeah.
It
Lots of
responds.
chemical things that have to move around in order to grow,
Yep.
live, survive, things like that, evolve.
And it responds to its environment and all kinds of stuff. And then let me understand being an insect and an animal. And then maybe after all of these experiences, consciousness has expanded its vibration enough to have the capacity to be in this body. I mean, if you really think about it, there is nothing more psychedelic than a human.
Yeah.
I mean, we are these transcendental objects the universe has manifested with feelings and thoughts and desires and pain and, so incredibly dynamic, this instrument we are for the source to know itself through. And if, the most important thing to understand about this whole concept of reincarnation is that the source all by itself has no clue what it is.
Mm-hmm.
It's just pure original innocence before anything is created. There is no context for it to have against itself to know what it's like, because it is the earliest thing in existence, right? But before anything existed, there was the one source, and it is pure. It is uncontaminated by anything. And so it's like, like a child. This is why we love innocent things, right?
Mm-hmm.
A child is so beautiful to us because it has no idea what it is.
Right.
It's just shining as what it is without this ego concept of self to contaminate it. Yes. To live up to and then to suffer from, a puppy, animals. We love animals because they don't know how amazing they are. They have no clue how wonderful they are. And that makes them more sacred to us. And so that is ultimately what the source is that most original, most sacred, ancient thing that can be imagined and beyond. And so it needs context to know what it's like. And that's what physical reality is. So reincarnation makes a lot of sense from that viewpoint, that this is all so the creator can have an understanding of what its nature is like. And it has to do that. It can't just do that in one little tiny lifetime and then whoop, all done.
Yeah.
It's infinite. There's nowhere near enough context it's given to know what it's like.
It's a challenging concept from the background of knowing it, as the creator as omniscient, omnipresent, all-knowing, has a plan for everyone, has a very distinct, there's no mistakes. Like there's a very interesting, because then when we start getting into polarities, for instance, we start thinking about, okay, well, in order for the creator, the source to know itself, it needs to know what it doesn't like. There needs to be experiencing a facet of itself through every avenue, which is why we can't judge when someone has chosen a certain polarity or path, because we are like, it's the universe experience itself through us.
Yes.
But the interesting, which I find that like that's a challenging concept when you've been brainwashed with over and over with this is how this is, and there's this man in the sky that's like, okay, you got it wrong in your teeny tiny spectrum of time, you're going to hell. I think I watched a podcast with Chris Tomlinson, I think is his name.
Aaron Tomlinson,
sorry. And it's funny because he said the same thing. I was having a discussion with my mom about the Bible, which was interesting, no less. And I said, it doesn't make sense to me that where we were before we got here on earth in the ether, like we're up there with God, chilling, whatever, getting ready for our incarnation on earth. And we spend however many years with him before we get here. And then we get here and we're separate from him. And then it's like, okay, you get 15 years if you're lucky, like 80 years if you're lucky, to then discover these very complex soul lessons, than to only be thrown in the lake of fire if you didn't get it in time. And I was like, that seems insidious. Why would he keep sending us here then? And then like, why would we keep coming if we knew that ultimately if we would have this veil of forgetfulness and we would get here and then we have to die. I was listening to part of that podcast and saying like, well then abortion would be loving.
Yes.
And, or things like that, where you would take someone out before their, what is it? The age of accountability.
Right.
That they have beforehand, before they know any right or wrong or whatever.
Getting murdered as a child would be the best thing that could happen to you.
Right. Right. Instead of having to go through this long ass, dense, terrible, suffering life, and only to be then thrown into
hell forever. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. If you think about, like, any good Christian does this, right? If they want to have their son or daughter appreciate the life they've been given more, what do? They send them on a missions trip.
Yeah.
Well, every good child needs to know how much they should appreciate and be grateful for what we've given them. So we're going to send them on a mission trip to Mexico to build some houses.
I love how every time you talk about, like, staunch Christians, they have to take on this very Texan accent.
The Southern accent. It just embodies the archetypes.
It does.
But, we do that to our kids, right? And I had that when I was young. I went on 4 mission trips to Mexico. And boy, howdy, did that give me a better appreciation of my life. And then you just think, well, but God don't need to do that. Like, of course he does. The micro, I can't
take this seriously.
But the micro is just a miniature viewpoint of the macro, of the totality. Everything we see and experience in this life is and has to be, there is no other way, has to be a miniature expression of what's happening from eternity.
Yeah.
It's all for context, for understanding, for expression. And we do that to ourselves because we just cannot really appreciate what we have until we taste and experience what it's like to not have it. Mm-hmm. And that's what God's doing in you and I right now.
Mm-hmm. That's so interesting, because the third density is the hardest one and the shortest one.
Yes.
So we come here. So what happens in third density? Like, what is the purpose of third density?
From what I understand from the law of one, the main purpose of third density is what Ra calls the choosing, which happens only under the context of the veil of forgetting. That's why there is an organic or authentic choosing in this density, is because we don't have access to any of our memories from previous lifetimes or whatever. So because of that, just like in a dream at night, the only reason you take the dream seriously is because you don't remember your waking reality. Yeah. The moment you remember it, you're lucid and you lose all, the dream loses all significance for you, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in the same way, if the source wants itself to be able to make a organic, authentic choice without infringement between the path of light or darkness, then it needs to create some environment where it's encapsulated and sort of safe from any other outside source that would influence that decision, right? Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So souls, we go through this third density after first and second, where third density is that of self-awareness, where basically that mechanistic nature, evolutionary mind that nature has built in second density, where animals are basically just intuitive beings. They don't think conceptually, they just react to their environment, and they react according to how that animal is programmed by evolution, right? Mm-hmm. So a tiger behaves like a tiger, not like an antelope. Yeah. You never see an antelope stalking a tiger and a tiger running from an antelope, right?
Yeah. Built in the DNA.
Yeah, because you could say their animal ego tells them how to behave, right? Right. Based on instinct. So in third density, once consciousness wakes up in the form, it then is still stuck with that animalistic program of its specific ego, which ours came from the great apes. And so in our ancestors in the social hierarchy and tribes and all this stuff that we in our past had formulated, well, the ego had evolved to keep up with that evolution and all of those variables. And so now we're stuck with these programs, and we call that ego. Yeah. And so this density, third density, is about the friction that ego creates against the source in the consciousness in the form that doesn't want to be bound by programs. It wants free will, right? We have this sort of tug of war that happens between consciousness and ego. And eventually consciousness, sort of like the butterfly breaking out of the cocoon, breaks out from the illusion of ego to know its true nature, which is perfect peace, perfect love, perfect harmony with all that is. And so that's the path of light, which sees through the illusion. But the path of darkness actually uses the illusion to have a different type of experience, which we call service to self. Right. And the service to self path still sees the illusion of ego, and you could say transcends it in a sense, But it says, hey, I liked a lot about that whole experience. I liked having control and domination over others. So let me actually use that viewpoint to enhance myself and go down this experience of the creator, which we could say is its opposite. So the negative path, essentially, instead of healing the shadow and healing all of its repressed emotion, it uses it as like a fuel source for domination and enslavement of others. So that's kind of the choosing is between those two polarities.